Chapter 18. Sunday dinner time. Doreen settled into a more comfortable sitting position and prepared to listen. He didn't get along with a lot of the other women or men. A group of transvestites hung around here, but they were more of their own group, so he didn't really fit in with them either. Often people who don't fit into any group form their own group, Doreen said quietly. That was us, he said. Manny and I had been friends a long time before all this. I knew him as Meredith for years, so it wasn't exactly a surprise when he finally came out of the closet. Gender changes are much more acceptable now. I don't think that the women were jealous of him. I think they looked at him like he was some freak, which just added to his sense of alienation. Exactly. And since losing him, I have just felt so alone. That's because it was just the two of you in your group, and when you lose one, you lost half. I mean, it would seem like you'd lost the better half, of course. Peter stared at her in surprise. You're a very surprising person. That's a very deep insight, and it's exactly how I felt. It's only now, as I look back, that my mind starts to get clearer about the drug's influence. And I see just how dependent we were on each other too. When you hadn't seen him by that morning, what did you do? I walked up and down the streets, asking everybody if they had seen him. But nobody had. Nobody had seen the truck. Nobody had seen the John. Nobody had seen anything, he said with a shrug. But then I was drunk or high, so getting people to talk to me wasn't easy. And everybody I asked were street people who kept to themselves anyway. But if somebody was killing other prostitutes, surely they would take note. But nobody else has gone missing, he said. Just Manny. Interesting, Doreen said, settling back on the bench. What about Manny's family? Did he ever talk about them? He talked about his son a lot, but his son went to live with his father when Manny became public about who and what he was. Occasionally he'd get depressed over what his choices had cost him, but on the whole, Manny was a tough cookie and didn't stay down long. How old was the son when he left? 13, maybe. He didn't like what Manny was doing. Right, and of course that's sad too. I don't think anybody can hurt us quite as much as family, Peter said quietly. Exactly, Doreen said. But it's also family who looks after us and loves us when we need it the most. Then you must have a different family than me, he said with a laugh. Then he stopped, shook his head and said, No, that's not fair. My father's done a lot for me, and I haven't given him credit for that. I really lucked out with him as my father. I wish I'd told him. I think he knows. He's talked to me about you. But like he said to me, it's hard to know how to help. I know. I'm really hoping I will have something good to say to him soon. The sooner, the better, because I think he needs to know you've at least turned a corner. He doesn't have much of a life, does he? He works at the second-hand store. I bought 4 cups and a bowl from him, she said with a laugh. It was a whole $3. He grinned at her. I got this free coffee from somebody today. That probably cost them $3. I used to be wealthy, Doreen said. And then I used to be extremely poor. Now I realize that wealth comes in many different forms, and it's not at all about money. Then she got up, turned to smile at him, and said, If you can think of anything else to add to this, would you call me? I don't have a phone, he said. Okay, can you use the phone at the shelter? Maybe, he said. Do you have your number? I might come up with something. She nodded, wrote it down on her notepad, and handed it to him. Just remember. I'm trying to help Manny. Let's at least find out what happened to him. Right, he said. Manny was a good person. Doreen stopped at that and looked at him. Did he help anybody? Was he friends with somebody who he might have helped, or somebody who might know anything about what happened to him? I don't know. He used to go to the women's shelter a lot and give them some money. Usually when he was high as a kite, so the centers sent him away all the time when he was like that. So he knew somebody there, maybe? Doreen asked. He ended up there after she separated from her husband, until she could get back on her feet again. But that didn't last long. She had come out at this time. So he went to the shelter and then in an apartment and then started on drugs, lost his job, lost his apartment, lost his son, and ended up on the streets. That's such a sad ending, Doreen said. It is for many. For me, well, maybe I can change my ending. Which was harder to get off of, the drugs or the booze? Drugs, he said. I kicked the booze as soon as Manny went missing. But the drugs were much harder. I would go in deep to forget, then wake up. It's been a slow process. Every day, I would just take a little bit less instead of shooting up. I'd make sure I spread it out over 3 days and then 4 days and then 5 days. She looked at him in admiration. That's actually quite smart. I never thought about that. Still, it's taken me 10 years, he growled. And what would you have done with those 10 years otherwise? Doreen asked gently. Look at where you are. You're 6 months clean. Keep sight of that as something very positive you've done, and let it be something you use to keep improving your life. Peter stared at her. You're good for me. I can't remember the last time somebody sat and talked to me as if I were a person and not a piece of garbage on the street. You're not garbage, she said sadly. The world's just very messed up. With the animals in tow, Doreen waved at him and then stopped and asked, Have you eaten today? He nodded. I had a big meal at the soup kitchen. Don't you worry. I'm okay. She smiled and said, Remember to call me. After that, she walked back around the corner to her car, her pets in tow. She got into the car and drove home. Inside, she felt so sad. What a life for father and son. She pulled up to the front of her garage, used the remote to open the garage door, and drove inside. As soon as she was in, she closed the door and let out the animals. Okay guys, she said, we're home. They raced out. As she opened the door to the house, the animals tore inside. She headed for the fridge. It'll be spaghetti again, she called out to the empty house. Is that a problem? She shrieked and turned to see Mac, leaning against the kitchen doorway. Were you in my house when I came in? She demanded. He shook his head. No, I've been out here on the deck waiting for you to get home. Oh, she said, her hand going to her chest. I didn't even think of that. And then she realized he wasn't standing in the open doorway. He was talking to her through the window. The open window. She groaned. I guess there's no point setting the security if I leave the windows open. She undid the security on the door, opened it up, and let him in. You can make coffee, he said. And you could cook more pasta, she said, because if you want spaghetti too, that'll cut into my supply of leftover noodles. He chuckled. Is that all you've been eating since we had it? She nodded. Pretty much. He groaned. You need to learn to cook a few more things. I do, but I really love this pasta. He shook his head, put on the tea kettle, and picked up the pasta pot. Then he put it on the burner and said, How much sauce is left? Have you been rationing yourself? She gave a tiny shrug and then nodded. You know that I could eat that every day for a week. She walked over to the cupboard and pulled out a large package of noodles. He looked at it and said, How much do you want me to cook? She rubbed her hands together in glee, gave him a fat grin and said, All of it.